making of an Elizabethan mind, a classical curriculum. Lecture 2. The World, the Latin May. In our last lecture we left a boy of 11 in a cold room with a Latin grammar and the strong suggestion that things would go badly for him if he failed to master it. Today I want to follow that boy out of the schoolroom and into the world he was being educated for. Because the grammar school was not the destination. It was the engine, and to understand what the engine was driving, you need to see the road. Let us consider what the educated man of the late 16th century actually looked like in practice, not as an idea, not as a curriculum, as a functioning human being operating in the political landscape of Elizabethan England. He has come down from his grammar school. If his family has the means, he has spent some years at Oxford or Cambridge, where the Latin has deepened into Greek, and the Greek has opened into philosophy, and the philosophy has tangled itself in theology, and all of it has been conducted in the same relentless spirit of disputation that began in the schoolroom. Then very likely he has proceeded to one of the Inns of Court, Gray's Inn, the Middle Temple, Lincoln's Inn, where he has studied common law, yes, but where he has also found himself in the most intellectually stimulating environment in England. The Inns of Court in the 1590s were not merely legal training grounds. They were something very close to what we might call a political and literary culture in concentrated form. Young men of good family, well educated, ambitious, gathered in close proximity, arguing, writing, performing plays for their own entertainment, and watching with very close attention the operations of power. These were the men who constituted Shakespeare's most demanding audience. When we speak of what Shakespeare's audience understood, we must not imagine a uniformly groundling crowd. The globe held a range. But the range included men who had construed Cicero in the original before they were 15, who could recognize a Virgilian allusion at 20 yards, and who brought to the theatre the same quality of informed, ironic attention they brought to the reading of a political dispatch. This matters enormously. It means that when Shakespeare wrote, he was writing for people who were doing at least two things simultaneously. They were watching the play, and they were watching the play, watching England. Now, I want to introduce you to two men, because they will haunt this entire course. They will haunt it because they haunted the Elizabethan imagination, and because understanding their relationship and what it cost is the key to understanding why the classical education was not merely ornamental. It was, in the most direct sense, a matter of life and death. The first man is William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's chief minister for most of her reign, architect of the Elizabethan settlement, a man of extraordinary political intelligence and almost preternatural caution. Cecil had been educated at Cambridge, had read his Cicero with exemplary care, and had absorbed from that reading a lesson that Cicero himself had perhaps not quite intended, that survival in political life requires knowing precisely when not to act. Cecil outlasted everyone. He was not, it must be said, a man whose company would have been particularly enlivening, but he died in his bed, which in Elizabethan political life was not something to be taken for granted. The second man is Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, and here we must pause, because Essex is one of those figures who seem to have been placed into history specifically to illustrate a point. He was brilliant, genuinely so, well-read, a capable soldier, possessed of a personal magnetism that contemporaries struggle to describe without reaching for words that embarrass them slightly. He was Elizabeth's great favourite in her later years, which was both his greatest advantage and, as it turned out, the mechanism of his destruction. He was also a man who had read his Plutarch, and had taken from it, one feels, rather the wrong lessons. Essex saw himself in heroic Roman terms. He was surrounded by men who fed this vision. His circle included scholars, poets, translators, men steeped in exactly the texts we will be reading in this course. And what those texts told Essex, or what he chose to hear them telling him, was that greatness demands action, that the truly great man seizes the moment history offers him. That cautious men like Cecil are merely the necessary furniture of a world that actually belongs to men of another stamp entirely. Whether any of these things are true is a question we will have considerable occasion to examine. What is beyond question is that in the spring of 1599, Essex sailed for Ireland to suppress the rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, with the largest army England had put in the field for a generation, amid a public outpouring of enthusiasm that his contemporaries compared, and the comparison was not made carelessly, to a Roman triumph. Shakespeare himself, in the fifth act of Henry V, written in that same year, gestures toward Essex's return from Ireland as the natural image of conquering glory. The play was performed while Essex was still in the field. The audience knew exactly what the lines meant. Essex did not return in triumph. He negotiated an unauthorized truce, abandoned his command, rode back to London in defiance of explicit royal instruction, burst into the Queen's bedchamber at Nonsuch Palace while she was still in her morning undress, and attempted to recover his position by the sheer force of his presence and her residual affection for him. Within 2 years he was dead, executed for treason following a botched attempt at a coup that had been discussed in his circle with, among other texts, a private performance of Shakespeare's Richard II, the deposition scene included, commissioned by his supporters the night before the rising. The classical education had given Essex the vocabulary of Roman heroism. It had not, it turned out, given him the judgment that Roman heroism actually required. Plutarch, read carefully, is in fact extremely clear on this point, but reading carefully has never been everyone's gift. I tell you this story at the beginning of the course because it establishes, I hope, beyond any further doubt, that the texts we are about to read were not academic exercises. They were live material. They circulated in a world where the wrong reading, or the right reading, applied at the wrong moment, could end with your head on a spike on London Bridge. That is the world in which Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar in 1599. That is the world in which his audience sat and watched Brutus decide whether to kill a man he loved for the good of Rome, and went home afterwards and did not write down what they thought about it, because writing it down would have been inadvisable. Let me say something now about the structure of the education itself, because we have spoken about its purpose, but not yet about its method, and the method is itself a lesson. The grammar school day was organized around a principle that the masters would have called, if pressed, the formation of habit, not the acquisition of knowledge, though knowledge was certainly acquired. The formation of habit. The idea was that the correct use of language, like the correct use of a sword, cannot be achieved by consulting a manual at the moment of need. It must be so thoroughly practiced that it becomes instinct. And so the boys passed, and translated, and construed, and then, crucially, composed. They took English prose and turned it into Latin. They took Latin prose and turned it back. They were asked, in the upper forms, to write letters in the manner of Cicero, speeches in the manner of Cicero, arguments in the manner of Cicero, until the manner of Cicero became, in some measure, their own manner. This exercise had a name. It was called imitation, or in the Latin, imitatio, and it must be distinguished sharply from what we might now call mere copying. The goal was not to reproduce Cicero. The goal was to understand Cicero's choices so thoroughly that you could make similar choices yourself in new situations. You learned the principle by practicing the instance until the principle was available to you without the instance. This is, when you consider it carefully, a rather sophisticated theory of learning, and it produced results that were by any standard remarkable. Consider what it means to have internalized, genuinely internalized, the argumentative structures of the greatest prose stylist in the Latin language by the time you are 16 years old. You do not merely know how to argue, you know, at a level below conscious thought, the difference between an argument that is structurally sound and one that merely sounds impressive. You can feel the weight distribution of a period, or when a sentence is gathering toward a conclusion, and when it is merely filling time. These are not small gifts. And they were gifts that transferred. The boy who had spent 5 years with Cicero and Terence and Virgil sat down to read Plutarch, as we shall, and found himself in familiar territory, not because the subject matter was the same, but because the quality of mind required to read attentively was already formed. He brought to Plutarch the same habits that Cicero had built in him. the habit of asking not merely what is being said, but why in this way, at this moment, for this audience, habit of reading, in other words, rhetorically. It is in this sense that the classical education was genuinely unified, even though it was delivered through many different texts over many years. The texts were various. The underlying discipline was singles. How do you use language to act in the world? And how do you read the language of others to understand what they are actually doing, as distinct from what they are merely saying? These two questions, pursued with sufficient rigor, turn out to contain a very large proportion of everything worth knowing about human life. Now, next lecture, we turn to the first author, the man whose clean, elegant, quietly devastating Latin was the first serious text a grammar school boy encountered. Publius Terentius Effer, Terence, a freed slave from North Africa, a man whose origins were as far from the Roman ruling class as it was possible to be, and whose comedies became the indispensable foundation of the education of that ruling class for the better part of 1500 years. There is a joke in there somewhere. Terence, I suspect, would have appreciated it. End of Lecture 2.